Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this A-level religious studies video. I'm Ben Wardle, and today we are revising the problem of evil and suffering. So we will be talking about what the problem actually is in terms of the logical problem and also then the evidential problem before we look at religious responses. So we will talk through three different Christian theodicies, and a theodicy is a defense of God. We'll take a look at St. Augustine's original sin argument. We'll talk about Alvin Plantinga's free will defense before talking through John Hick's soul making theodicy as well. And for each one, we'll be asking what is their defense, and then we'll look at the strengths as well as the weaknesses of it before we make that overall judgment as to whether any of those theodicies can successfully defend God from the problem of evil. So lots to talk about today. Let's start by talking through the OCR specification, which sets out everything we need to know and discuss for this topic. So we need to talk about the different presentations of the problem. And that just means we need to know the logical problem and also the evidential problem. So the logical problem is a priori. It is all about the inconsistency between God's omnipotence and his omnibenevolence with the existence of evil. So if God was omnipotent, if he was all powerful, surely he would be able to end all evil and remove all suffering. And then if he was omnibenevolent, if he was all loving, then surely he would want to end all evil and remove all suffering. So the fact that evil and suffering exist presents a logical problem for religious believers, doesn't it, in terms of those divine attributes and their inconsistency with the existence of evil. We've then got the evidential problem, which is a posteriori, and that means it is based on that empirical evidence, the evidence of so much terrible evil in the world when we turn on our TV and we look at the world around us. And we'll be talking about the quantity of evil, but also the pointlessness of it as well. So the fact that it doesn't seem to serve a purpose. And that will be very important when we talk about John Hick's theodicy, because he says evil does have a purpose. It has instrumental good in that it is a catalyst for soul making that helps us to strengthen our souls and develop our characters. But of course, a big problem for Hick is the pointless evil and suffering in the world. We will then be looking at our theodicies that seek to propose some justification or reason for the existence of evil. So Augustine will be our first one. We'll talk about St. Augustine and his original sin argument, that it isn't God who's to blame, it's actually Adam and Eve. We'll then talk about Alvin Plantinga and his free will defense before talking through John Hick, who was influenced by St. Irenaeus in his development of the soul-making theodicy. And as I say, for each one, we will examine it and explain it before looking at the strengths and the weaknesses of it. And then what we'll be doing as we go through today's video is we'll be discussing these 4 questions from the OCR spec, which will help us to prepare for any potential question on this topic. So for Augustine, we'll ask whether his view of the origins of moral and natural evils, which of course for him is Adam and Eve disobeying God in the Garden of Eden, that original sin, we'll ask whether that view is enough to spare God from blame for evils in the world. So is he successful in putting all of that blame onto Adam and Eve and saying that God is blameless in the existence of evil? We will then talk about John Hick and ask whether the need to create a veil of soul making, as John Hick says God needed to do, would justify the existence or extent of evils in the world. So can we say that evil is an instrumental good that helps to develop our souls and strengthen our characters? We'll be asking whether the logical or evidential aspect of the problem poses a greater challenge to belief. So is it the inconsistent triad, or is it the evidence in terms of the quantity and the quality of evil, or of course the lack of evil when we talk about it being pointless? And then finally, and this question ties everything together, do we think it's possible to defend monotheism in the face of evil? So is Augustine, Plantinga or Hick successful in defending God and belief in God or not? That is the question we will be asking at the end once we have considered their theodicies and the strengths and weaknesses of each. So plenty to discuss, a really brilliant topic. Let's start with our key terms, shall we? So we know what we're talking about today. The first key term is very important. It is theodicy. And a theodicy is a defense of God. So it's where a theologian or a philosopher develops the defense of God. And we're going to talk through three of them today, St. Augustine, Alvin Plantinga, and John Hick. And a theodicy is a theory to justify God's righteousness when faced with evil. So how can he be all powerful? How can he be all loving when there is evil in the world? We'll be looking at those defenses. We'll be talking through those explanations. Our next key term is moral evil. This is evil that is the result of human free choices. And we might say that that is easier to defend and explain because God has lovingly given us free will. And then, of course, moral evil is when people choose, and the key word there is choose, to do the wrong thing. So they choose to cause harm, things like murder, rape, and robbery, for example. So perhaps moral evil is easier to defend than natural evil, because natural evil comes from nature or natural sources. So of course we can't then say, well, somebody has chosen to do it, because we are the victims of natural evil rather than the causes. Although some people do argue now that climate change is contributing to, more tsunamis and natural disasters happening. But in terms of those two, we've got to be making that judgment as to which one you think is harder for Christians to respond to and make sense of. Is it the existence of moral evil or natural evil? And then a final key term is suffering, because suffering refers to the pain or harm experienced by a person. And that is always the result of moral evil or natural evil. So they are our key terms today. Let's talk to our key scholars, or let's meet our key scholars, shall we? I'm imagining they're in the room with us. They've sat down, they've got a cup of tea, and they're going to argue their cases. So we're going to talk about St. Augustine and his original sin argument. Of course, we're very familiar with him, aren't we, from the Christianity section of the course. So we'll hear what he's got to say about Adam and Eve, and we'll ask whether he is successful in blaming them, or does God still have to bear some responsibility? We'll be talking about Alvin Plantinga and his free will defense. And then finally, John Hick with his veil of soul making. And as I say, it will be our job in terms of preparing for the exam to make that critical judgment as to whether any of these scholars can defend belief in God when confronted with the problem of evil. So who is going to be successful, if any of them? Now, when we are talking about the problem of evil, we need to always remember that there are two types. We've got natural evil and then moral evil. So I've put some examples of each on the screen here, if you'd like to categorize them, just to make sure we're really confident with those two concepts. And then as we do that, I want you to think, which type presents a bigger problem for a theist? So do you think it is natural evil or moral evil? So of course, our examples of natural evil here are tsunamis and earthquakes, whereas moral evil is the terror attacks, rape, murder, and genocide. So which is a bigger problem? You could argue that it is natural evil because we are not responsible for this. We are the victims of it. Now, interestingly, St. Augustine is going to blame Adam and Eve for natural evil. He says that their fall in the Garden of Eden brought about disharmony in nature, and that explains natural evil. So he is actually blaming humans. He's blaming the first two humans. So very interested to hear your thoughts on this. Of course, with moral evil, we can say God is omnibenevolent, so he lovingly gave us free will. And St. Augustine has a great quote on this, actually. He said, a runaway horse is better than a stone. So could that justify moral evil, that God lovingly gave us free will, even though he knew that some people might misuse it, because free will is the greater good? That is what Alvin Plantinga is going to argue with his free will defense. So yeah, do let me know in the comments, do you think natural or moral evil presents a bigger problem for religious believers when they're defending God from the problem of evil? So talking of that problem now, remember, whenever we talk about the problem of evil, there are two presentations of it. We've got the logical problem and then the evidential problem. So the logical problem is a priori. It's based on three statements that we're going to say cannot simultaneously be true. And then we've got the evidential problem, which is a posteriori. It's based on the evidence, on the quantity of evil, and then the pointlessness of it as well. So When we're talking about the logical problem, we're going to mention Epicurus. He pioneered this in ancient Greek times, and we present it as the inconsistent triad. And inconsistent means that they can't all go together. Triad means triangle. So there are three statements reflecting the three sides of the triangle. Let's have a look at them, shall we? So the first one is that God is omnipotent, that God is all-powerful, which of course is a key Christian belief. The second one is that God is omnibenevolent, so God is all-loving. Again, another key Christian belief. In the Gospels, it says God is love, and in the Gospels for omnipotence, Jesus says that with God, all things are possible. We then have the third statement that completes the triangle, which is that evil exists. So we've got three statements here that when we think about them logically, there is a problem, isn't there? There is an inconsistency, because if God was all-powerful, he would be able to remove all evil and end all suffering. Let me just highlight that. He would be able to. He would have the power to. He would have the ability to. In terms of omnibenevolence, we could say that if God was all-loving, he would want to remove all evil and end all suffering. So if God was loving, he wouldn't want us to suffer, so he would remove all evil and end all suffering. So evil, and the fact that evil exists, therefore presents a big problem, doesn't it? And so this is the inconsistent triad. The fact that evil exists means that God cannot be both omnipotent and omnibenevolent. So which one are Christians going to deny? Are they going to say, actually, God isn't omnipotent, and that is what process theologians do, or that God isn't omnibenevolent? God actually isn't loving, and he doesn't mind the fact that people suffer. Might they deny evil exists? That is what St. Augustine does. He says evil is not a thing, but a privation. His phrase is privatio boni. It's the privation of good. In the same way that darkness is not a thing, but it's an absence of light, he says that evil is not a thing, but an absence of good that was caused by Adam and Eve turning away from God and disobeying him in the Garden of Eden. So really interesting to look at how our Christian theologians, seek to resolve this problem. But for now, this is the problem. Whenever you think of the logical problem, you're going to think of the inconsistent triad, and the fact that evil existing means God cannot be both omnipotent and omnibenevolent. So that causes a very big problem. Let's have a look now at some bullet points that break this down for us. Evil challenges the nature of God. This means it is a logical problem. And as I mentioned, this problem was raised by Epicurus in the 3rd century BCE, so over 2,000 years ago. Theistic religions believe God to be omnipotent and omnibenevolent, and yet, as we know, evil does exist. And the key question here is, how can God be omnipotent and not stop evil? How can God be omnibenevolent and not want to stop evil? So in order for the inconsistent triad to be resolved, one of the three parts, one of those three statements must not be true. So how might we resolve it? Well, as I mentioned, perhaps God is not omnipotent, so he's not actually all-powerful, and he cannot control evil, so he can't stop it. And this is the view of process theologians who say that God is not omnipotent. They take a panentheistic view of God, that God is in the universe and the universe is in God. And so he shares in our suffering alongside us. But would a Christian actually deny God's omnipotence? Would a God who lacks omnipotence be worthy of worship, for example? The next point is that perhaps God is not omnibenevolent. And this is a view that has just come from the New Testament's focus on love. The God of the Old Testament, for example, seems fair but brutal. Things like blood in the world. We all know that story of Noah's Ark, don't we? So have we got it wrong when we say that God is omnibenevolent? Could this problem actually be resolved by accepting, no, actually, God isn't omnibenevolent. He's not all-loving. Of course, the problem with that is that Christians do believe that God is all-loving. We have that great teaching in the New Testament that God is love. So what do you think so far? Do you think that Christians would be prepared to deny God's omnipotence or deny his omnibenevolence? I don't think so. I don't think that is sufficient. So we've got to find another resolution, don't we? Could it be that evil does not exist as we think it does? It is not a substance like goodness is. It is an absence of good in the same way that darkness is an absence of light. And that is what St. Augustine said. He believed it was a privation, which means an absence of good. And the term he used there is privatio boni. So do you think any of those resolutions work or not? Because, of course, we will then be looking at our theodicies from Augustine, Plantinga and Hick, which do seek to resolve the problem. So that is the logical problem. And whenever we think of the logical problem, we think of that inconsistent triad. We then have the evidential problem. So remember, there are two presentations of the problem, the logical problem with the inconsistent triad, and then the a posteriori evidential problem based on the evidence that we observe. And the key scholar we'd mention here is David Hume. Evil is evidentially a problem because it can be seen in the evidence of people suffering. So we can actually see it. When we turn on our televisions, we read the newspapers, we look at the world around us. The first observation is the quantity of suffering, so the amount of people who are suffering around the world. The second observation is the pointlessness of evil, the fact that it serves no useful purpose. Now, John Hick is going to argue that evil does serve a purpose, that it is an instrumental good because it is a catalyst that facilitates our moral growth and our spiritual development. But we can say that there is a lot of suffering that is pointless, that doesn't actually help us. I mean, we're going to talk about John Hick's argument later, but just for now, we've got to think, okay, maybe some suffering we could say does help us to grow, that we learn from it and we're strengthened by it. But what about suffering that serves no purpose whatsoever? How can we actually resolve that problem? And does that prove that there is no God, or that God lacks omnipotence or omnibenevolence? A few points here then is that God allows natural disasters that displace and kill many thousands of people. So the quantity of suffering there, especially when it's about natural disasters, which are an example of natural evil. We've then got animal suffering, of course. So a few examples here. The Great Dying was an event around 250 million years ago that saw 90% of marine life and 79% of land species disappear, probably through different natural disasters. So again, natural evil. And we can't say, well, that served a really positive purpose in helping the animals to grow and develop their souls, because of course it's not believed that they go to heaven. So that again seems to emphasize the quantity and pointlessness of this evil and suffering. Another example is this case study here from William Rowe, quite a famous one. He described the fawn in the forest. So a fawn is a young deer. And he said, imagine that that fawn is trapped in a forest fire caused by a lightning strike. So again, a freak natural incident. The fawn dies a slow and painful death over many days. This serves no apparent purpose and it serves no greater good. So again, why is God allowing that? A lot of the time with the problem of evil, we do focus on human suffering, don't we? But what about the animals? They've all been created by God as well. Why would he allow them to go through so much suffering, especially that is so pointless and isn't going to help them with their character development and with their soul making? So as you can see, the evidential problem presents a big problem as well. And remember from our discussion questions, we have got to weigh up and think about whether the logical problem or the evidential problem presents a bigger problem for religious believers. So very interested to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think the a priori logical problem is the bigger problem, or do you think this evidential problem, the empirically based observations of the quantity of suffering and the pointlessness of evil? So as you can see, if we bring them both together, evil and suffering presents a very big problem for religious believers. And so we've got to ask, how do Christians resolve the problem? Because we know that they don't just see the logical problem and the evidential problem and then go, do you know what? I don't believe in God anymore. You're absolutely right. The problem is too overwhelming. I'm going to abandon my beliefs. We know that over 2 billion people today are still Christians. So how do they reconcile the existence of evil with their belief in God? And not just any God, with an all-powerful and all-loving God. As we saw before, they might deny one of the three statements that make up the inconsistent triad. So they might deny God's omnipotence or his omnibenevolence. For example, Griffin's process theology accepts that God is not omnipotent. So they're quite happy to deny that. We then, of course, have St. Augustine and his original sin resolution. We've got Alvin Plantinga and his free will defense. And finally, we've got John Hick with his veil of soul making. So in terms of now resolving the problem, we are going to talk through St. Augustine's idea, Alvin Plantinga's solution, and John Hick's resolution as well. And then I would love to hear from you in the comments. who you think has got the most convincing, coherent, and successful resolution to the problem? Or do none of them have a successful resolution? Does the logical problem and the evidential problem show that actually you cannot believe in the Christian God in the face of evil? So let's get started, shall we, by talking about St. Augustine. And for each of our theodicies, for each of our defences, we'll go through our AO1 knowledge, and then we'll do our AO2 evaluation points, where we look at the strengths and the weaknesses. So let's talk through St. Augustine's original sin argument. His theodicy is known as the sole deciding theodicy. So we will compare Augustine with Hick. Remember, Hick's is soul making, whereas Augustine's is soul deciding. Now, in order to understand his theodicy, we have to look at Genesis, the first book of the Bible, which is where Adam and Eve commit the original sin in the Garden of Eden, and that is known as the fall. And for Augustine, that is where evil and suffering enter the world, because God created everything perfectly. And this is a really important starting point. Augustine believes that God is perfect and he created a perfect world. He then placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden was a perfect paradise for them. They had everything they could have ever wanted. They were going to live forever, and he placed them in this paradise, and he placed them there with free will. And this is very, very important, because this is where Augustine thinks everything goes wrong, that God gives them free will and they then misuse it, because they are then tempted by Satan in the form of a snake, and they choose to disobey God. Now, some people then ask, well, if God is omniscient, surely he knew that was going to happen. So he shouldn't have given them that free will, because he then knew how catastrophically wrong everything would go. But St. Augustine defends God and says, no, he had to give them free will because it is a greater good. He said, and this is a brilliant quote from Augustine, that a runaway horse is better than a stone. So God had to give them free will, even though he knew, because he's omniscient, what would then happen, because free will is the greater good, because free will means that you can choose to worship God and you can choose to follow his commandments, which gives your faith meaning, and it gives your life purpose and value. Whereas if he just created moral robots, goodness wouldn't have any meaning. So free will is the greater good, and the risk of evil and suffering then happening is the price to be paid. And this is something that Alvin Plantinga develops with his free will defense. But let's stick with Augustine for now, because his entire theodicy is based on a literalistic reading of Genesis. So another important point here is that if someone doesn't believe Genesis is literally true, then this entire theodicy is going to fall apart, because it depends on Adam and Eve having literally existed and having been literally put in that Garden of Eden. So we have to abandon belief in evolution, and we have to take that literalist understanding of Genesis, because he says that when God had put them in the garden with free will, they chose to disobey him. And their disobedience is known as the fall, because it is a fall from grace. Everything is perfect. There is harmony between heaven and earth. There is a great relationship between God and humanity. But then Adam and Eve choose to disobey God, and that is known as the fall. And that, for Augustine, is the origin of both moral evil and natural evil. It's the origin of moral evil because we then all inherit original sin, which means we are born with a tendency to be sinful. And it leads to disharmony in nature as well, which leads to natural evil. So we have got the entirety of Augustine's theodicy here based on Genesis, and it is all centered on Adam and Eve choosing to disobey God in the Garden of Eden. That is the moment where evil and suffering enters the world, because remember, their actions have massive implications. They have these monumental consequences, because they lead to disharmony in nature and they corrupt human nature. People now inherit Adam and Eve's original sin because, and here is your key quote from Augustine, we were all seminally present in the loins of Adam. Now, worth noting, there's absolutely no scientific evidence for this whatsoever. However, this is what Augustine believed, that we were all seminally present in the loins of Adam, because Adam and Eve are the mother and father of humanity. So we are therefore all descendants of Adam and Eve, meaning we share in the effects of original sin. So that leads to moral evil because through sexual reproduction, we pass on and transmit original sin. So everybody is born with original sin and they're born into a sinful world because remember, there is disharmony in nature. So the entirety of Augustine's theodicy is based on blaming Adam and Eve. So of course, if you want to bring in some critical analysis here, you could be saying it's fatally flawed because most Christians today don't believe that story is literally true. And if you don't believe this literally happened, then you can't blame Adam and Eve, because if they didn't exist, they can't have committed the original sin and we can't inherit original sin from them. Now, here's the reason, and this is again another really interesting point, that God doesn't intervene and say, well, look, Adam and Eve have done this. I don't want anyone else to pay the price for it. Because some people might argue, and this is a great argument to make, well, why is God then allowing all of humanity to pay the price for what Adam and Eve have done? Why should I suffer today because Adam and Eve decided to eat a piece of fruit in the Garden of Eden? And Augustine's comeback here is that God is fair and just, so he cannot stop evil and suffering because he cannot interfere with free actions. In order for us to have free will, actions have to have consequences, and God can't be interfering because God is just and God is fair. So he has to let the consequences of actions play out. And the consequence of Adam and Eve's original sin is that we all inherit original sin, that we all have to pay the price for what they've done. Free will is the greater good because, as we mentioned before, a runaway horse is better than a stone. So it's all looking quite negative, isn't it? This is all quite pessimistic now. Adam and Eve have sinned, which means there is suffering in the world and we all inherit original sin. However, because of God's omnibenevolence, he does still want to help us. So even though we don't deserve to be helped, because remember, we have inherited original sin from Adam and Eve, we were seemingly present in the loins of Adam, God, because he's merciful, because he's loving, does still want to help us. And so as an act of God's grace, he sends Jesus to earth in order to save people from their sins. And that is why the crucifixion is so important. So with St. Augustine's theodicy, we have got the fall, which is where Adam and Eve disobey God and bring evil, suffering, and death into the world. But then, of course, we've got the redemption. And the redemption is through Jesus Christ. So his theodicy really emphasizes the importance of Jesus as the source of salvation, because his crucifixion is the act of atonement that pays the price for human sinfulness. And then his resurrection is that ultimate victory of good over evil and life over death. And remember, St. Paul wrote that Christ died for our sins. And John the Baptist said in the Bible, Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. So if we bring all of this together now, for Augustine, evil comes from the fall, which affects harmony in the world and results in humans all deserving punishment. So remember, the key point here is that because of what Adam and Eve have done, we all deserve eternal damnation. We all deserve to go to hell. And that is why it's called the soul deciding theodicy, because their decision in the Garden of Eden decides the entirety of humanity's fate. We all deserve to go to hell because we are born with original sin and we then have that tendency to sin. So we all pay the price for Adam and Eve. So for Augustine, there is no blame put on God whatsoever. God did a good thing by giving them free will. All of the blame is placed, onto Adam and Eve. However, remember, there is a glimmer of hope. There is a little slither of optimism because God's omnibenevolence shows that humans have not been abandoned. He then chooses to send his son into the world in order to save the world from sin. And that is why there is the incarnation at Christmas. So what do we think of this explanation? Is it coherent? Is it convincing? Do we think that St. Augustine has successfully defended God? Well, let's start with our strengths, shall we? We could say that a strength of his theodicy is that it is consistent with scripture, which remember Christians do see as the infallible word of God. So his theodicy is very much grounded in Genesis, isn't it? And remember, Genesis 3 is where we have this story of the fall. It is also consistent with what St. Paul then writes in his later letters. He wrote that sin entered the world through one man, which of course is referring to Adam. So it is consistent with St. Paul's belief there about the origin of sin. And St. Paul also writes, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So the idea that we do deserve that eternal damnation because we are all sinful is again seen in the writing of St. Paul. So his explanation, I would say, is a very, very biblical one, arguably the most biblical, because it is grounded in accepting that biblical story of the fall as being literally true, and so having implications for all of humanity. We could say it successfully absolves God from blame by explaining evil is a privation of good. Remember, evil was not something God created during his 7 days of creation, but it's something that was introduced by Adam and Eve's disobedience. So it's when they turned away from God that they introduced evil and suffering into the world. Interestingly, this is supported by Aquinas, another really important scholar on the course, who agreed that evil is not something, but rather the privation of a good. And this is how we get God out of trouble, really, because we say, well, don't worry, God didn't create evil. It was caused by Adam and Eve. So that means God can't be held responsible. God can't be blamed. Another point is that it is consistent with the contemporary belief in free will, isn't it? Our criminal justice system, for example, assumes that we do have free will. So, his entire argument, remember, is based upon the idea God gave Adam and Eve free will and they chose to misuse it. That brilliant quote from Augustine that a runaway horse is better than a stone. So if you think about what we believe in modern society, we do actually agree with Augustine on this. So even though many people might not agree that that story is literally true, they would agree that we do have free will, although a group of people who wouldn't are determinists. And we'll talk about them more when we're critiquing Alvin Plantinga. But I think that is an interesting point, that his explanation is based on free will. I suppose you could say that is a better defense against moral evil being a problem. But with natural evil, can we really blame hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, etc., on Adam and Eve's free will? Surely that can be seen as quite a weak attempt at resolving the problem. However, one final strength for you, and I think it is an important one for Christians, is that it emphasizes the importance of Jesus. It says that he is essential for salvation. And remember, that is what Christians believe. If you link it to the pluralism topic, an exclusivist would be agreeing with Augustine that we can't be saved through anyone else but Jesus, that he is the source of our salvation. And you could say this theodicy really does emphasize his importance, that he had to enter the world in order to save the world from sin, that we can't earn that salvation for ourselves. We deserve eternal damnation. And yet in God's omnibenevolence and love, he chose to send his son into the world in order to save us from sin by dying on the cross, that act of atonement, and then rising from the dead. So quite interesting how we can see this as a very Christian theodicy in its emphasis on the Bible and then its emphasis on Jesus as our saviour as well. What about our weaknesses then? There's quite a lot, as you can imagine, for us to talk about. The first one, which is a brilliant one if you are using the strength on the left there, is that it depends upon a literalist understanding of Genesis. So if you're going to say that a strength of this is that it's consistent with scripture, you can bring in your critical analysis, you can bring in the rebuttal, that it depends on a very, very particular understanding of scripture, which is a literalist understanding of scripture. And of course, the big problem we've got with that is that many Christians today do not believe that Genesis is literally true. The Catholic Church, for example, do not believe that Genesis is literally true, although interestingly, they do believe in original sin. So most Christians today do not believe that we are all descendants of Adam and Eve. They would support scientific explanations such as the theory of evolution. And evolution doesn't start with God putting Adam and Eve in the garden. It is a process of evolving over millions of years through natural selection, isn't it? So we could therefore say the foundation of this theodicy is flawed. We cannot all inherit original sin from Adam and Eve because they weren't the first two human beings. So really interesting that this argument is dependent on a literalist understanding of Genesis. And so the entire argument is flawed if you don't believe in Genesis being literally true and Adam and Eve literally being the first human beings and that we are all descendants from them. Our next point is that even if Genesis was literally true and Adam and Eve did eat from the tree, it's unfair to punish all people for their actions. So this is a really great this is a really great criticism, isn't it? Because we've just said that, if someone doesn't believe in Genesis being literally true, then that undermines the theodicy. But now we're going to double down and we're going to develop that by saying, even if they did believe it's literally true, it's still not a sufficient defense, because it's unfair to punish all of humanity for the actions of two people. So even if you are one of those Christians who believe Genesis is literally true, this still does not succeed as a defense, because instead it raises questions about God's omnibenevolence. How can he be all loving when he is prepared to punish all of humanity for what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden? How can you punish human beings today for something that Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden? And remember, what the action actually was eating from a tree. So why does two people eating from a tree mean that however many years later, people are dying in tsunamis and earthquakes? Surely if God was all powerful and all loving, he'd want to stop that, and he'd be able to stop that as well. Where is his forgiveness? Now, of course, Augustine's response would be, well, he does do something. He sends Jesus into the world in order to save the world. But you could argue that that's a weak response, because actually it's not fair that we are being punished and held responsible in the first place for what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden. So very interesting to think that whether you take a literalist or non-literalist understanding of Genesis, this still, we could argue, is a flawed theodicy. Another point is that it is too pessimistic about human nature. We could say that the idea humans are all born sinful is very negative, isn't it? That we're all born with original sin seems to be a very negative position to take. And we could say that causes a lot of problems because it leads to people feeling shameful. And this can be very damaging for them psychologically. So Catholics, as we know, believe in infant baptism because you need to wash away that original sin and start your journey to salvation within the church. But if we actually think about the idea that we are all born sinful, that does seem very pessimistic. Now, again, Augustine would defend himself and say, no, I'm an optimist, because even though we are sinful, God still wants to save us and Jesus will be redeeming us. However, if we focus on the idea of everybody from the second they're born being born with original sin, that is quite a negative idea. And we can say that leads to shame and guilt that can be very damaging for people. I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it, about states of nature and whether people are born good, they're born sinful, or are we born neutral? John Locke, for example, said we're born tabula rasa, we're born as a blank slate. So very interested, to see some synoptic links there, actually, to the first topic on the Christianity paper, where we look about Augustine and his beliefs about human nature. Another weakness for you is that if God is omnipotent, he could have acted to remove original sin and the effects of the fall. So if God is omnipotent, surely he can do anything at all. So he can remove the effects of the fall in the Garden of Eden and stop original sin being transmitted down the generations via sex. So why didn't God do that? If he's omnipotent, surely he should be able to do that. And that then links in as well with the weakness from before, where we're asking about God's omnibenevolence. Why is he punishing all of humanity for the actions of two people? Again, your response to that is that because God is a fair God, that he has to allow the consequences of actions to play out in order to avoid compromising free will and in order to avoid compromising justice. Excuse me, I can't speak today clearly. I need some green tea. Right, there we go. Hopefully I'll be able to articulate a sentence now. Fingers crossed. A final weakness then is that we could bring in John Hick, so we can actually compare Augustine's theodicy with John Hick's theodicy that we'll be talking about in a few moments' time, because John Hick said that evil is not a privation. He didn't believe that it was an absence, but actually it has a purpose. So John Hick is prepared to believe that God has created evil because it is an instrumental good, that it is a means to an end, in the sense that it is a catalyst for our character development and our spiritual growth. So John Hick, for example, is going to refer to St. Paul's belief that suffering produces perseverance. So for John Hick, evil is not a privation, but it actually has a purpose. So if we just take a step back here and we think about those strengths and those weaknesses, I wonder what judgment you're reaching at this moment. Do you think that the strengths of this theodicy are strong, or do you think that actually the weaknesses outweigh any of those strengths? So do you think at this moment in time, original sin can explain the problem of evil and it can defend God from the problem of evil? Or do you think actually the weaknesses show that this is a flawed and weak theodicy? So that is our first theodicy. It is St. Augustine's original sin defense. Let's have a look at a second theodicy now, shall we? And see if we think this one is more convincing and more coherent, or whether actually this could be weaker than Augustine's. This is Alvin Plantinga's free will defense, and we will again start with our AO1 knowledge. And I want to start actually with a really brilliant quote from Alvin Plantinga, which is all about the value of free will. So he wrote that a world containing creatures who are significantly free, let me highlight that, is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. So he is saying that free will is the greater good. Let's find out what that means, shall we? So the first point is that he believed it would be logically impossible for God to remove evil without also removing free will. So even if God is omnipotent, he cannot remove evil without also removing free will. Now, your argument could be, well, if God is omnipotent, surely he can do anything at all. So yes, he could do that. You know, we shouldn't be saying anything is impossible for God. But remember, if you believe that omnipotence means that God can do anything that is logically possible for him to do, you would be agreeing with what Plantinga is saying there. For example, can God sin? And if he can't sin, does that mean he's not omnipotent? But if he can sin, then how can he be God? So, you know, we could spend all day, couldn't we, talking about the nature of God and these divine attributes. But for Alvin Plantinga, he believes that omnipotence means God can do whatever is logically possible. And he's saying it would be logically impossible for God to remove evil without also removing free will. Now, of course, that would be a problem, because if he removed free will, we would not have free will. And remember, he believes a world containing creatures who are significantly free is more valuable than a world containing no free creatures at all. So again, it's the idea of free will being a greater good. The moral value of free will justifies God, really important word, isn't it? With a theodicy, it's all about justification and defense, permitting the existence of evil. Life would be valueless without free will, so it is better to have free will despite the evil its misuse can lead to. So it's the price that we have to pay, it's the risk that God has to take. Very interested to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think that life would be valueless without free will? Is Plantinga right there that free will is the greater good? Now, he believed that natural evil is explained by the free will of Adam and Eve. Remember, so he's agreeing with Augustine there that Adam and Eve disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden and that brings about disharmony in nature. He would then, of course, agree as well that moral evil is explained by the free will of human beings today. So even if we don't inherit original sin, we do have free will and people choose to misuse that. And that explains suffering, because people choose to murder, to steal, to commit other kinds of evil as well. So he is therefore explaining the two by free will. So for the free will defense, as you can imagine, the focus is on free will and using that to defend God by saying free will is the greater good that gives value to our lives and value to the world. So natural evil would be explained by the free will of Adam and Eve. So again, this does require a literalist understanding of Genesis. So we could see some problems there, couldn't we? And then moral evil is explained by the free will of human beings today. And God has to allow that because it's a greater good. He has to allow the fact that some people will misuse free will because the fact we have it gives value to our lives, and it also gives value to goodness as well. So if we were moral robots, there wouldn't be value in being good because we'd be programmed to be good. It is all about the choice that gives it value. So he would say Alvin Plantinga would say that free will is the greater good that justifies God permitting evil and suffering, because a world containing creatures who are significantly free is more valuable than a world containing no free creatures at all. So what do you think of that? I'd be very interested again to hear your thoughts. Is he correct that free will is the greater good? And so God can be defended and the problem can be resolved by saying that free will is, I'm going to say it again, the greater good. And so there is that necessary consequence of the risk being there. People may choose to do evil things and therefore cause suffering. Because, and I think it all comes down to this actually, that it would be logically impossible for God to remove evil without also removing free will. Mackey's criticism is going to be that that is not the case. That if God is omnipotent, surely he should be able to remove evil without also removing free will, and that we could all be made by him so that we always freely choose the good. Now, Plantinga says, no, that would not be true free will, but Mackey is going to criticize him in just a moment's time. But before we look at the criticisms, let's talk about the strengths of this free will defense, shall we? So what works well? We could say it satisfactorily explains moral evil in a way that is consistent with the criminal justice system. Our justice system, as we know, works on the understanding that humans do have free will and therefore can be held responsible for crimes they choose to commit. Very simply there, the free will defense is saying that we have free will and that free will is the greater good. And that, we are going to argue in terms of our evaluation, is consistent with the modern way of thinking. Our legal system today assumes that we do have free will and we are then responsible for the choices that we make. So this might make it appealing to a contemporary Christian in the modern world. We could also say his account for natural evil satisfies those who uphold Augustine's belief in original sin, because remember, his explanation for natural evil is consistent with Augustine's, the idea that it is caused by Adam and Eve, whose disobedience brought disharmony between, within, the natural world. Augustine believed Adam and Eve caused the disharmony in nature. So you've got two scholars in agreement there. Another one is that it is consistent with a literalist understanding of Genesis, which contains the story of the fall. So if you believe that the fall actually happened, then Plantinga's defense can be seen as consistent with scripture. But of course, for our critical analysis, we are going to say that it doesn't work if you are a non-literalist. So again, it all depends, doesn't it, on how somebody understands the Bible. And I think with Plantinga's free will defense, the stronger element, you could argue, is the defense of moral evil, because evil is the price to be paid for that greater good of free will. However, I do think we could argue in the exam that it is then weaker, or it's less effective when it comes to natural evil, because it then depends on this literalist understanding of Genesis. And as we said about Augustine, even if you do believe in that literalist understanding of Genesis, do you think it's fair people pay the price today for Adam and Eve's choice? Because it doesn't seem fair that we are then held responsible for what Adam and Eve chose to do in the Garden of Eden. Let's have a look at the weaknesses then, shall we? What are the problems with it? Let's build on what I've just said, actually, because my first weakness is that natural evil cannot be successfully explained as being caused by Adam and Eve. This is based on a literal understanding of Genesis, which, as we've said, many Christians do not hold. And then going further, developing that evaluation point, even if Genesis 1 was literally true, is it fair for God to punish all of humanity for Adam and Eve's decision to eat an apple? Now, remember, for Plantinga and for Augustine, they wouldn't be saying God chose to punish us. They would be saying that he's just not prevented the necessary consequence from playing out. So it's not that God's then chosen to punish us, it's that he's then been a bystander and allowed that disharmony to occur. And as a result, natural evil continues to occur. But of course, again, Augustine would defend this by saying God does do something. He sends Jesus into the world to save us. But is that sufficient action? Or do we want God to do more? Do we want God to just stop it straight away and not have then sent Jesus into the world? Another point I would make with that one as well is that if Jesus' death on the cross was meant to pay the price for sinfulness, why are there still natural disasters? So if his death is the act of atonement, and that is God's way of saving us from all of this, why does natural evil continue following on from that crucifixion? Let's have a look at another weakness then. Could an omnipotent God not create humans who always freely choose the good? So this is where we're going to bring in Mackey as a critic. Where's the highlighter? Here we are. He criticized the free will defense, and he asked this. It's a great quote. Why could God not have made men such that they always freely choose the good? The fact that he hasn't means he is either not omnipotent, he's not able to do that, or he's not omnibenevolent. He doesn't want to do that. So Mackey makes, I think, a really interesting criticism here of Plantinga, and it is based on the nature and attributes of God. He's saying, well, if God is all powerful, surely he could have made men such that they always freely choose the good. And the fact that he didn't do that, the fact that he just gave us free will with the risk of us then committing evil. And remember, God's omniscient, so he knew what was going to happen. That, for Mackey, is a massive problem. And he says that means that the free will defense is fundamentally flawed, because God could have made us free, but in a way that we always freely choose the good. Because he's omnipotent, he can do anything at all. However, Plantinga did respond to that. He did reject that criticism because he said that would not be true free will. So if God had chosen to create us in a way that we always freely choose the good, that would not be true free will, because we would always be doing good and we wouldn't be choosing to do it. So he would say that that takes away the value of goodness if we are programmed to always choose goodness. So Mackey would be wrong, according to Plantinga, in expecting God to do that. He's asking for too much, basically, because that wouldn't then be true free will. But I wonder what you think there as well. If God is omnipotent, surely he should be able to do that. And that could be, in your essay, a really great critique of the free will defense, but always great then to bring in Plantinga's response that the criticism is flawed because it would lead to a denial of free will. And then finally, an important point when it comes to the free will defense is that free will has not actually been proven. Determinists, for example, deny that humans have free will. So, of course, if someone doesn't believe we have free will, we can't put the cause of evil and suffering as being down to free will, because if we don't actually have it, then it can't be the result of us misusing it. So again, take that step back now, consider those strengths, think about those weaknesses, and make that judgment. Do you think that Plantinga is successful in his free will defense of God, or do you think that it is actually a flawed theodicy? And we make that judgment by weighing up the strengths and the weaknesses and ascertaining whether we think that the strengths are successful or the weaknesses outweigh them. So please do make that judgment. And then also think about Augustine's original sin argument as well. Do you think at this stage Plantinga's theodicy is more successful, or are you thinking it is Augustine who comes out on top at this stage? Let's have a look now at a very different theodicy. So I think Augustine and Plantinga have obviously got a lot of similarities, haven't they? Whereas for Hick, he takes a very different approach and develops a very different theodicy. So maybe you might think this one is more convincing. Let's start with our AO1, shall we? The first thing to know is that the word vale means a place or a valley. So John Hick is saying that the world is a place of soul making, and that is what justifies evil and resolves the problem of evil, because evil and suffering are a catalyst for our moral development, which means we can then go to heaven. Important that we know the context in which John Hick developed this. So he was influenced in developing his theodicy by Saint Irenaeus and his soul-making theodicy. John Hick believed that evil is instrumental. So in the same way that musical instruments make music, he believed that evil makes souls. He saw it as providing a catalyst for spiritual growth and character development. So he believed evil serves a greater good that is part of God's plan. And he's going to talk about an epistemic distance, which is a gap between God and humanity. So we can't fully understand God's plan. We have to trust in God's plan. Now, He also, very interestingly, uses Genesis in developing his theodicy, but he does not focus on the fall and he does not focus on Adam and Eve. And actually, John Hick's theodicy is seen by some as consistent with evolution. And we'll talk about that more when we evaluate. But it is important to note that he does ground his theodicy in Genesis as well, but he focuses on a different part of the scripture. He focuses on Genesis 1, verse 26, which states that God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. And remember, this is the Imago Dei doctrine. Now, Irenaeus and Hick believe that means we are born imperfect and then must rise to perfection over time. So God's likeness is something we grow into. So they believe that we are made in God's image, but then we grow into his likeness. So we are made in his image, but then we grow into his likeness. And that's where we use this phrase that we rise to perfection over time. And of course, we've then got to think about how we actually do that. What is going to be the catalyst? What is going to be the instrument for making that happen? And of course, Hick believes that it is suffering. So he said that the world is not meant to be perfect. It is heaven that is going to be perfect. And the world instead is meant to be a veil of soul making, which is where we develop into God's likeness. And in order for this to happen, there needs to be two things. There needs to be free will and there needs to be evil. Free will means that we choose to have a relationship with God despite the epistemic distance. That is the gap in knowledge between God and humanity. So we can't have 100% certainty that God exists because that would devalue our belief in him, wouldn't it? So if we had absolute proof that there was a God, we could argue that would devalue having faith. The whole point of faith is that you are putting your trust in something, you are having hope despite not having certainty. So making that leap of faith, we could say. And so free will means that we then choose to have that relationship. Very interesting, by the way, that all of our theodicies have referred to free will. Really, really significant point, I think, and something to definitely mention in your essay. He believes that evil and suffering are then catalysts for our character development. So we talk about a catalyst in science, don't we? It is designed to speed up a reaction, and evil and suffering are catalysts in that they speed up our character development and our moral growth. So our response to them develops our virtues, such as compassion and charity. So if you think about it, the parable of the sheep and the goats, Matthew 25, says that we can only go to heaven if we perform works of mercy, if we feed the hungry, if we clothe the naked, if we care for the sick, for example. But of course, if there isn't suffering in society, we can't show mercy and we can't perform those works of mercy in response. So there has to be suffering as that catalyst for us developing our virtues and doing those good things. So it is very interesting to think about the fact that if suffering didn't exist, we wouldn't be able to become good people. Now, you could say, well, if God's omnipotent and omniscient, he would be able to, and he would know how to develop our souls in a way that didn't require suffering in the world. However, the argument Hick is making that God knows best, and he knows that this is the best way to develop our souls and strengthen our characters. I mean, with this one, I always think of Kelly Clarkson and her song, What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Stronger. So it's the idea, and actually we see it in the Bible as well, not quite a Kelly Clarkson song, where St. Paul writes that suffering produces perseverance. So for Hick, he's not denying that evil exists, and he's not denying that God has created it. He believed that it serves a greater good. It has a higher purpose in strengthening our souls and developing our characters because it serves as that catalyst. We perform good works, we do good things, we become virtuous people in response to suffering. And I suppose you could think about life in general, couldn't you? You know, if somebody lives a very sheltered life and they live in a bubble their entire life, are they going to then be able to cope with any challenges that do come their way? Whereas if somebody has gone through a lot of hardship and difficulty, Does that make them a stronger person? Does that make them a more resilient person? So that is something to think about in terms of our own lived experience. Do we agree that evil and suffering are instrumental? Would we be where we are today and who we are today if we hadn't gone through difficulty and hardship? You know, I don't want to turn this into a life coaching session, but I do certainly think that some of our biggest setbacks in life can then serve as a stepping stone and a catalyst for us moving forwards and achieving really great things. But as I say, let's not make it into a life coaching video. Let's keep working towards that A star. So if we bring all of this together, he believed that we can only grow into God's likeness. Remember, we have to rise to perfection and grow into God's likeness over our lives if we have free will and the world contains evil. Suffering is instrumentally good for our growth. It is that catalyst that facilitates our development. I would love again to hear your thoughts on this one. Very interesting that he again bases it on the Bible, but on a different verse. And there is more consistency with scripture for Hick when he says that suffering produces perseverance. And that is a quote from St. Paul in his letters. So Hick and his veil of soul making. Do we think that this is a better theodicy and a better explanation than Augustine and Plantinga? Or are we already identifying some significant problems? Well, let's talk through the strengths of this one, shall we? The first one is that we could say it is consistent with evolution and the idea of human development over time, because he's saying that we rise to perfection, that we develop over time. And you could say a strength of that is it makes the theodicy more appealing and persuasive in the 21st century. So we're not expected to believe a literalist account of Genesis. We're believing in humans developing over time. And you could argue that is very consistent with our evolutionary ideas about the origins of our species, rather than saying we began with Adam and Eve being put into the garden and us then inheriting original sin from them. You could say that it is more optimistic than Augustine's theodicy. Instead of saying we are born sinful, the focus is on rising to perfection over our lifetimes. This can be seen as an opportunity for us rather than a burden. So rather than us feeling guilt and shame, we could feel more optimism and hope that we are going to grow and develop into God's likeness over our lives. And talking of optimism, really important that for Hick, he is a universalist. He believes that everybody will ultimately go to heaven, because even if you've not had that moral growth into God's likeness on earth, you will then go to purgatory, where that character development will continue. So we could argue he is much more optimistic about humans than Augustine. So Augustine isn't saying you're born into sin and you deserve eternal damnation. Unlike Augustine, with that very negative view, Hick is saying you are born imperfect, but then you rise to perfection over your lifetime. And that could be seen as an opportunity rather than a burden. So we're going to compare soul deciding with soul making. Our next point, and this leads us on to universalism, is that his theodicy could be more consistent with belief in God's omnibenevolence. So he has this belief that we will all ultimately go to heaven. And he believes that our souls will all ultimately be perfected. And so even if that means we have to go to purgatory after death, we will all ultimately end up in heaven. And you could say that that is much more consistent with belief in God's omnibenevolence and the idea that God is all loving. However, a couple of critical analysis points here. The first one is, does that undermine justice? That every single person is ultimately going to heaven? Does that not undermine justice if someone has committed really awful crimes? Does that not seem unfair that they are still going to end up in heaven anyway? But also, if we're saying God is so omnibenevolent, why is this his means of soul making? So why do we have to go through suffering in order to have our souls developed and to grow into God's likeness? Surely if God was all loving, he would want us to be as pain-free as possible in this life. Why would he subject us to so much turmoil and hardship and suffering in order to end up in heaven? Why do we have to go through that on the way? Is that an omnibenevolent method of soul making? Is going to be our critical response there. Let's talk about some more weaknesses then. We could say it cannot explain pointless evil and suffering. And I think this is a really, really strong argument here that we can actually link back to the evidential problem, can't we? Because we're saying that evil and suffering is instrumentally good. It serves a purpose, it benefits us, it strengthens us. But what about when we see evil and suffering that is pointless? And remember Rose Thorn in the forest example. Nobody's getting any moral growth out of that. Nobody's getting any character development out of that. So we could say there are many cases where evil and suffering have no instrumental value. They are not catalysts. They are just catastrophic, and they cause so much unnecessary and unbeneficial evil and suffering. So how do we explain that? So you could say his theodicy cannot account for pointless evil and suffering in the world. So link that to the evidential problem of evil. Developing that, D.Z. Phillips has a really brilliant criticism. He was absolutely scathing about this theodicy. He said, we cannot speak of moral growth in this way. He said, if you look at what Hick is actually saying, it's really insulting and it's really quite rude when it comes to the people who go through suffering. So he said, we cannot justify the existence of horrendous evils such as the Holocaust during World War II by saying that we need them in order to grow. If we think about the Holocaust and the millions of people who lost their lives in such a horrific, evil atrocity, how can you say, well, that was instrumental? That helped people in their moral growth and their personal development. How can you say that such unspeakable evil has a purpose behind it to help us to grow? So he said, we can't say that. He said, we cannot speak of moral growth in this way. Or, for example, somebody with cancer, you can't turn around to them, especially if they've got terminal cancer, for example, and say, here you go, a bit of cancer to toughen you up a bit. This will help you with your moral growth. It seems, as I say, quite insulting. Could it be quite patronizing if somebody is going through suffering that you say, it's going to strengthen you, don't worry, it's for a greater good, it's the catalyst? You know, how are people actually going to respond to that? And when we think about some of the most awful suffering in human history, how can we actually turn around and say that that has a purpose, that that is instrumentally good so that people can develop their souls and strengthen their characters? So it becomes problematic when we think of case studies such as the Holocaust. Can we really speak of moral growth in this way? D.Z. Phillips says, absolutely, we cannot. Another weakness is we could ask, if God was omnipotent and omnibenevolent, surely he could have created a better catalyst for character development rather than suffering. So if God is all powerful and he can do anything, and God is all loving, and he wants us to be happy and he doesn't want us to suffer, surely he wouldn't therefore have chosen this as his method of character development. I would bring in omniscience there as well and say, if God is all-knowing, surely he would know a better way of developing our character and helping us to grow into his likeness rather than forcing us to endure hardship and suffering, especially some of the, you know, the most awful suffering that we see. For example, children who are killed in natural disasters or events such as the Holocaust. So again, we can link that to the logical problem, and we can talk about the nature of God, the attributes of God, and whether really an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God would choose to ensure our moral growth in this way. Can he not, or could he not, have created a better catalyst for character development rather than suffering, especially when we apply that to certain case studies and examples? So let's bring all of this together, shall we, and make some judgments as to which of our theodicies is the most convincing, if any of them are. So our first discussion question was, do you think Augustine's view of the origins of moral and natural evils is enough to spare God from blame for evils in the world? So remember, his view is that it's all Adam and Eve's fault. Do you think he is right? Do you think that that is a successful defense? Or do you think actually God does need to be blamed because he created them, he knew what they were going to do because he was omniscient, and then he's not actually done anything to intervene and remove that original sin? Although, of course, Augustine would say, yes, he has. He sent Jesus into the world. Our next discussion question, can the need to create a veil of soul making justify the existence or extent of evils in the world? Obviously, D.Z. Phillips would say no, absolutely not. You cannot speak of moral growth in this way. But of course, for Hick, yes, it does justify it because evil is an instrumental good. This world is not meant to be perfect. It's not meant to be pain-free. It's meant to be a veil of soul-making. Does the logical or evidential aspect of the problem pose a greater challenge to belief? And I think after considering those theodicies, it is interesting to ask, does that logical problem of God's nature or does that evidential problem of the evidence pose a greater challenge? Which one do you think Augustine, Plantinga, and Hick have had a tougher time trying to defend and resolve? And then finally, the most important question, is it possible to defend monotheism in the face of evil? So has Augustine succeeded by blaming Adam and Eve? Did Plantinga succeed by saying free will is the greater good? Or do you think John Hick was successful in saying that evil and suffering are catalysts for our character development and that we live in a veil of soul making? So I hope that's all been helpful. Please do let me know any comments and any questions you've got on this topic in the comment section below, and good luck with all of your studies. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.